terms of technology. And I guess increasingly feel that we are in a world where monopolies exist in technology, in the way that we use technology, the way we interact with each other. And perhaps the companies which are behind those monopolies are questionable. Some of the ethics that they deploy and the way that they conduct business certainly needs to be brought into more scrutiny. And increasingly, I'm finding myself writing about that, trying to share my opinions on that, hoping to change other people's opinions on what good looks like and what we should be doing with this vast technology and power we've created at our fingertips. So I'll be sharing some thoughts on that today.
That's great. Thank you very much, Andy, and we're delighted that you're with us. Russell Slatford is the head of Bournemouth Collegiate School, and it's my delight and honour to be the chair of his local governing body. So we see quite a lot of each other. Delighted, Russell, that you're on board today.
Thank you, Ian. Yeah, I have to be careful what I say, everybody, because Ian's my boss. So I can't step out of line. Look, I'm delighted, firstly, to be invited to talk to you today and on this interesting topic. My background obviously is one of education. I've been the headmaster at the school for nearly 6 years. For those of you who don't know, we've got two school sites, one over in Poole and Parkstone area and one in Southbourne, educating in the region of about 650 pupils. And of course, what that comes with is, I think, a wonderful kind of diversity and richness. And as Ian spoke about at the beginning of this idea about kind of creating a community of character, in many ways, I think is my job as a head teacher, headmaster. It is about looking at the community that I am very privileged to be responsible for and thinking really about what it means to provide them with opportunities and richness and contrast and diversity, to provide them with that character. So I think it's a very welcome topic of discussion from my point of view, and I'm delighted, as I say, to be able to join in the discussion today. And I look forward to hearing what other people think about it. So thank you.
Thanks,
Ian.
Russell. That's really great. I'm so glad you're with us. Paul Tansey, would you care to introduce yourself, please?
Absolutely. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Paul Tansey, and I'm the managing director of a local business, very similar to Andy's, actually. In fact, Andy and I have been on almost identical career journeys. As we started our business within a year of each other, grew our businesses in parallel, and have stayed in touch the whole way to share ideas. So my career is very similar to Andy's in that respect. I'm involved in several communities. I guess I'm on the board of trustees for a charity for young carers. I'm a governor of Poole High School, but I confess I have had to step back from that, as I've had to reduce what I'm doing recently because of the pressures of business and keeping my people employed, which is has to be my number one goal right now. You know, we employed 26 people at Intergage, and I've considered it my goal for the last 9 months to make sure we continue to employ 26 people at Intergage, and that has been really, really tough, but we've made it so far, so touch wood, we can continue. I'm a director of the Dorset Chamber of Commerce and Industry and a former president, the last president actually before our current president, and that's been interesting in terms of a community of business people. And trying to communicate what that community is about has been very interesting. So, you know, business communities are often viewed as self-interested. And in this instance, what we tried to do at the Dorset Chamber is to entirely turn that on the head. So where a business community might be accused of meeting to sell to each other, what we've tried to do is promote a culture of meeting to help each other and support each other. So rather than having 700 or 800 other businesses to sell to, we try to promote the idea that you have 700 or 800 businesses trying to help you, which is much more positive. And it makes for a friendlier networking environment when you're looking for people to help, not necessarily looking for people to sell to. So that's me. That's my background. Look forward to taking part in the debates with you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Paul. Inspector Danny Tamblyn, Great that you're a panel member again. We enjoyed it, all that you had to say last week. Could you explain, because there'll be some people on board today who weren't with us last week, a bit about yourself, your background, and your interest in this topic, Danny?
Certainly. Thank you very much for having me once again. It's very much my pleasure. So my name's Danny Tamblyn. I'm the Neighbourhood Policing Inspector for North Bournemouth. I've been a police officer for 23 years, and a very broad variety of roles within that, each of which in its own sense is a community of character, I would argue or suggest. Whilst the overall policing mission guides every police officer and police member of staff, how we achieve that mission and the part we play in it varies greatly. So I've worked in roles as varied as firearms, working on the armed response vehicles you'll see driving around, close protection for members of our royal family and government ministers. I've trained officers in that role, worked on public order for 14 years, taught self-defence to the police for 20 years, all of which have very defined characters, very different community aspects as a community within a community. And currently in my role as a neighbourhood policing inspector, community is the watchword for me. My role is to ensure that my communities are safe and they're serviced and they're happy in their daily lives. So my particular interest perhaps in this is how we define character, how we define community, and the role the police play in that to make sure that we are playing our role in encouraging what would be acceptable characters, building communities and playing our part in holding them together, but also enforcing community values once they are established amongst all these different characters. So I'm looking forward to hearing everyone's views around that.
That's fantastic. Let's have a really good discussion. I mean, of course, one of the issues with building communities of character is how you deal with those who disagree with you. How do you deal with those who won't fit in? And let me begin from my own place representing the church and recognise that our track record has not always been totally wonderful. Indeed, at times it's been totally regrettable and appalling. Who was it who burnt Galileo? Because he stepped out of line? Big Brother called the church. Who was it in the Reformation who burnt Archbishop Cranmer? Yeah. So the church certainly doesn't have a fantastic track record, but I had no idea as we put together this session of ethics forums with this topic that we would go, because we put this together around about November time, that we were going to be at a point at which there'd been an incredible example internationally of what you might call big brothering. After last year's election, that great big brother Twitter attached health warnings to then President Trump's tweets, didn't it? Then, as many of you will remember, in the wake of the storming of the Capitol by a mob of Trump supporters, Twitter and Facebook, there's two big brothers, began shutting down multiple accounts, including that of the president himself, now permanently suspended from tweeting. And when Trump loyalists declared their intention to move their conversation from Twitter to Parler, Twitter, with minimal content moderation, that's what he was intending, Google and Apple deleted Parler from their app stores, and then Amazon kicked Parler off its cloud service, effectively deleting it from the internet altogether. It was a quite stunning demonstration of power by those international digital big brothers, Amazon, Apple, Google, Twitter, and Facebook. Any comments from our panel on that? How you deal with those who disagree with you? We can take the conversation in many other directions, but let's start with that. How do you deal with people who disagree with you?
I'll jump in very quickly at the beginning. I don't know the answer, and I wish I did. However, I did write about this. In fact, today it's just gone live. But I found it incredibly hypocritical, disappointing, sad that all of these companies, particularly Twitter, I think the most, allowed Trump to do all of these things, say all of these things for many, many, many years, with many people commenting that it's going to lead to something bad at some point. And sure enough, 500 people stormed, the central House of Parliament, or however you call it, Congress in America. And then Twitter decides, well, that's enough's enough now. We need to bin him off. It was very good for them when he was becoming president. It was very good for them when he was president. They had many, many years to try and address this issue. And just as he was on the way out the door after he'd lost the election, they decided, well, we'll get rid of him now because he's not going to be worth anything to us. So for me, that was very cynical move. It's a very calculated move. I don't believe any of these companies are going to change any of the way they behave. I think it's not being good for democracy. However, then at the same time, you must allow people to have free speech. If people want to say stuff, then I think free speech is one of the biggest rights anyone can really have. So at what place and what position do these companies who, again, have too much power, too much control, allow themselves to put a stop to some of this foul play? Because in theory, anyone should be allowed to say something. And let's say Twitter deleted all of these bad players. They're going to move somewhere. The internet is big enough for everyone to have a home. In fact, I think Parler now is back live, but it runs through Russian servers, if you weren't aware of that. Make of that what you will. But as to how do you control this and what should the rules be, I don't know. I think regulation has to come in terms of what the platforms can and can't do. Facebook for many, many, many years, even now, says we are not a media publisher. We don't control the content on our platform, we're just a platform. I think there must be some acts brought about either through the US or through the EU, which will say, if you're a platform, these are things you should be doing, and this is the regulation you need to be doing. Because at the moment, we're leaving it to themselves, and the only thing they care about is money. Are they making profit? And if they're not, then they have really no care at all. So I think there's going to have to be some bigger play in place. What those rules are, I don't know. Maybe people that run communities, some of the other guests, will have better ideas than me, but that's just my opening gambit.
That's great. Thanks, Andy. Another of the panelists like to come in.
I'm happy to go next if
Great.
others are. I think it's a very interesting discussion about free speech, because whilst it's something that we hold dear, again, I look at it in my context, educating young people. It's all about understanding that free speech is something to be cherished, but something that has consequences. Educating young people, indeed adults, that with that responsibility and that ability to be able to speak freely, it comes with an implied understanding that comment, that message will have an effect. So developing things like empathy, sympathy, understanding, context of others, privilege, challenges, comes with the wonderful world that we live in that allows us free speech. And I think where it becomes very difficult is that free speech now is so removed from individuals. And things like cyberbullying, which is, of course, is something that, again, schools spend a lot of time educating young people on. The big issue there is that you're not feeling a response. You don't see the consequence of the words or the phrases or indeed the images that you are presenting out there. And where you have somebody like Trump, where he's touching the lives of millions and millions of people, you lose, it becomes kind of insular and buffered against that reality of the response that you get. I mean, if I say something now that's controversial, alarming, I can hear the response of the people on this call. But social media takes all that away and indeed encourages the freedom of speech without thought or consequence. And I think that's the message within this, and there's been some articles written recently about that exact thing, about the place of social media in our world and what part they have in policing, monitoring. I think Andy's right. I don't think it is going to change. I think ultimately it's got to be up to us as individuals to manage how we behave in those kind of forums.
Danny or Paul, would you like to come in?
Yes, yeah, it is a very difficult area. I agree. I mean, in terms of how do you deal with people that disagree with you? It was one of the questions you asked. But I think the first thing to do is to listen to them and actually try and understand them and understand where they're coming from, understand the context of the disagreement, because too often we, all of us will react too quickly to what we're hearing. So that's, I think the first thing to do is always to listen and try and listen deeply, because I am a person who, if I disagree with something, I feel an instant fight or flight response if it's violent enough, and the chimp response, the crude response, is to become angry and everything else. And I have taught myself over a number of years to calm down and listen, and to counter with listening whenever somebody disagrees with me. And it is difficult sometimes. It's the way that people disagree with you that's important. People can disagree with you with respect, and people can just disagree with you in a confrontational way. So there are two different things: how you deal with confrontation, how you deal with reasonable disagreement. I think it's also fair to say we live in a very, very low trust world, and President Trump has been a contributor to that state of affairs. There's something called the Trust Index, which is a sort of barometer of trust in the world, which I'd recommend anybody to go and have a look at. It's fascinating to look at the lack of trust in all institutions across the world, the lack of trust in our educators, in the church, in business, particularly amongst politicians. There's very, very little trust in the world, and we indeed have, within 2 generations. If I look back and say, my grandparents grew up in a world where they trusted their politicians, and they were proud even of their politicians, and they lived in a world where they trusted the church, and they trusted their educators, and they trusted the bank and the bank manager. That is a world away from where we are right now. We live in a world with very little trust, and where companies are concerned, coming back to Twitter, it's really interesting because businesses, today I think people want more from businesses than just products. People want businesses to have a cause or a purpose, and we see businesses adopting causes, and it's whether or not one could be cynical now about the purposes of people doing it. But I think society wants businesses to be about more than making profit, and it likes businesses that seem to have a purpose and a cause. And I think businesses have to have values, and they have to publish those values, and they have to stick by them. So, like Andy, I thought it was extremely cynical that Twitter only took action to, their values only mattered when Trump was on the way out. That was extremely cynical. If they had those values, they should have stood by them much, much earlier. But I think, it's one of those instances now where businesses in particular, we've got to have values, publish values. People don't trust businesses. People don't trust salespeople. People don't trust marketing people. People don't trust anybody. And we've got a whole generation that's grown up without the ability to trust anybody at all. So, yeah, it's a really interesting thing. I'd say summarize, values and purpose are really important. Increasingly, we have to have values, we have to have purpose, we have to have our own rules in these communities. We have to make them very public, and we have to stand by them. I just wish Twitter had done it much earlier, like Andy.
What's your perspective as a police officer, Danny?
Okay, so my slight caveat there. I'll do my best to give you my perspective as a police officer, but I would say that I don't represent all police officers. And whilst there's nothing I wouldn't say on this format that I wouldn't say if it was being run by Dorset Police, this is still my view as an individual as well. So it's difficult to get these unentwined. What I would say, not so much how would I deal with it, is how I wouldn't as a start point. And that is, I wouldn't want to control things. The police, you often hear that the police need more powers to deal with X, Y, Z. There is an awful lot of statutes, an awful lot of laws. We have an awful lot of power. We don't need more, in my view, unless we have new and emerging technologies that create issues that weren't around when certain laws were written. My view is that control should be minimal, because if we're not careful, we end up with a cancel culture or no platforming for people, where we say that actually you can say what you like until the point where it becomes offensive. And the difficulty there is who decides what's offensive. Now, the law allows for people to insult. I forget the judge who made the decision, but it came about in a stated case where he said words to the effect of, if something's not worth, if something is not, doesn't have the potential to insult somebody, then it may not be worth saying. And I find the example of Trump quite interesting, in that I think it's a very good point, and he's certainly an icon for this topic. But what we know about Trump, aside from his tweets, are what the media have told us about Trump and what they've broadcast about Trump of his tweets. Because very few of us, I doubt, follow him on Twitter. We follow what the media have published, certain things on Twitter. Now, I hasten to add, I'm not in any way a supporter of Trump or his character or his policies. I'm not suggesting that. What I have learned as a police officer is, I learned this very, very quickly, is the media will tell you what they choose to tell you of a story, and they will tell it in a manner that will maximize their sales. And you'll notice that, and the example of Twitter there was a good example. As politics ebb and flow and stories ebb and flow, you'll get a different view from the media. So we have to be, I think, very mindful of what happened in the period before the story was told and what happened immediately after the part of the story that's being told. And there's certainly something I've learned a great deal with, if you use the example of body-worn video. You will see, we had an example of this recently, actually, in relation to a COVID breach. It was a very topical matter. It got raised on social media, police officers arresting people on a bench, just for sitting on a bench, apparently. What happened in the hours leading up to that interaction and what happened in the seconds afterwards weren't shown, funny enough. But that tells a very, very different story. So what I would say is, I would be, until behavior incites action and definitively incites action, I don't want to use the phrase anything goes. What I'd say is be very, very careful before we start to limit people's freedoms of speech, because that will, I can see how that could very easily snowball. Be very careful who we choose limits that speech.
That's very interesting. Thank you. So let's come at it from another angle, from the angle of those who might be controlling, leading various aspects of the community. If we're going to be trying to build a community, and we're taking the presupposition that a community, any community that's worth being part of, needs to have positive character. I began by saying that Christian communities try to get close to the character of God as found in Jesus, but they then disagree about how that's interpreted. If we're going to build communities of character, how do we do it? What means are justified? I mean, one of them you spoke about, Danny, was limiting freedom of speech. What means can be used to build a community of character, and what sort of character would you like your community to be? Any panelist?
Yeah, if I reverse it, if I go first in this one. So I think you hit the nail on the head there in terms of defining what would be character, because there are some groups whose communities will be very different to what we chose. Stalin and Hitler were very successful in building communities of character, very, very successful. But most of us would not want to live in those communities and would disagree with the nature of the character they had. You can enforce a community of character on the surface to an extent. And the notion of freedom itself within those communities is limited. You know, we're not as free as we like to think we are. We all wear seatbelts. We all stick to a degree to the speed limit. We all follow basic traffic law to stop at red traffic lights, partly for self-preservation. We don't want to get hit. But we are governed by a number of laws and rules that the vast majority of us do follow. For me, I think that if you're going to define a community of character, again, coming from a negative point of view, put yourself in the position of the least advantaged person in that community. So if you're going to say, these are my positives, these are the characteristics I would like, and therefore it doesn't include these individuals, make yourself that individual. So if, from a Christian perspective, the person that would be most disadvantaged in your community was somebody with a religious belief, would you choose to universalize that and make that your character of your community? I suggest not. So as soon as we start considering individuals we don't want in our communities or characteristics, that's perhaps the part to start from. And so why is that? And would I want to be disenfranchised in the same way?
Yes, it's often been said to be a gauge of what your community is about, as to who are the minorities and, more sharply, who you exclude from your community, isn't it? Or who chooses to exclude themselves. Russell, I'm interested. How does this, in your experience, play out in building communities of character in school?
I mean, there's a phrase that's used a lot, has been for the last 2 or 3 years, about education with character. And I absolutely support what Danny was saying there. I think for me, developing character is not about making, and I'm talking mostly about a school environment, it's not about making it easy, but it is about making it safe and supportive. I mean, I'm often asked by parents, particularly when their sons or daughters are looking to join the school, what are you looking for? And I will always tell them that what I love about education, my school, indeed any school, I hope, is the wonderful variety that you get, whether that's variety of interests and skills, variety of characters. And I think what is so important is, yes, to establish, as we've spoken about, a set of parameters. We may call them rules. That sometimes sounds quite strong-handed at times, so that people understand what we judge is the acceptable way to behave and to operate, and to give young people that sense of where that boundary is, whether that's the one around free speech. But we want to embrace and celebrate difference. Good communities, in my mind, are ones where you've got people with self-esteem, who are happy, who've lived in an environment where it doesn't always go to plan, but they've got the personality and the characteristics that equip them to be able to manage, understand, possibly with help and support. But a big part of that, and a big part you see in schools of young people growing up, is understanding difference. Everybody wants to be a part of something, which is why the kind of Trumpisms, I think, that have gone on have generated such support, because I think people feel part of something, and people feel that there are other people out there like them. A 5-year-old and a 55-year-old are no different. We are all like that. So the character bit becomes, what do we understand those kind of parameters and boundaries are, as to what is positive about being part of something, and when it starts to perhaps become negative.
Thank you. Paul or Andy, would one of you like to jump in and add a few things?
Shall I do that, Andy? I think that a community of character, if our businesses are communities of characters, what do we do in businesses to create what we might call culture in our businesses? And it is about the publishing of a mission, vision, and values, and living the values. And when we're recruiting people who reflect those values themselves, who want to be part of a community with those values. So it is in business, which I think we're trying to build, above all else, a magnetic community, one that attracts people who have similar values and appreciate our mission and our purpose, and putting that up there front and center and living it is really important. And increasingly there are businesses, which I think is a great idea, who start every internal meeting by just reminding everybody what their vision is, what the mission and purpose is, before we do anything. And I think that's really good. So I think that it is important to allow yourself to be called on it as well. So you can say, well, as the leader of this business, these are our principles, if you like. If I'm not behaving in line with those principles, I expect to be called on it. But also, when we're evaluating the performance of individuals on an ongoing basis, that people's performance has to be evaluated not just in terms of the money they make, but their alignment with our values and their behaviour in line with our values. And one of my friends is a director of a bank in London, and he's very successful. And I asked him what his job was, and he said, My job is to go around and get rid of people who don't behave in line with our values. And it's like, so he is actively a policeman of values within his community.
Big brother.
So, I think that those are the things. I think that if people don't behave in line with your values, if we want to be magnetic to customers as well as talent, which is an increasingly difficult battle to win in business, we have to be seen at all stages to publish those values and live by them. And that's what I think you have to do in business.
Thanks, Paul. Andy, over to you.
Yeah, I think most people have hit the nail on many heads there, or heads on very different nails. I think for me, leadership is probably the thing that makes the community happen. I've been involved in many different communities over the years, and a lot of them have fallen by the wayside because, they can be membership groups, they can be people with similar interests, but they haven't got off the ground. Yes, you can have all of the rules, you can have all of the vision in the world, but you need someone who's a leader, people that can buy into a person or a belief or a process. We talked about the negative examples of Trump and Hitler, etc., from history. Those people were believable. Those people had a mission. They had a way of communicating that people, rightly or wrongly, could align themselves with and believe in and be part of. So yes, you need those values, and yes, you need to publish them. You need to make sure everyone lives by them. But you need, again, going to Paul's point, you need someone who's going to enforce them and make sure they happen, and for other people to then get on board and believe this vision that someone's outlined. Because with the best will in the world, communities can be thought up overnight and you can write everything down, but if there's not someone who's leading it and sharing the beliefs on a regular, consistent basis, then it won't get off the ground. And I guess probably leadership is one of the things, like Paul said, talent. I think that we're really lacking, particularly in the business world, because a lot of people don't want to take that step up. They don't want to be shot at. They don't feel confident. They don't have perhaps the training or the determination or the people skills to get to that point. And that's, again, I think, reflected in society. Perhaps some of the politicians we've got are not seen as good leaders. Even if you look into football, I watch a lot of football, and a lot of the teams, perhaps in the past, was very successful because there was one person who was pushing things forward. They were the one there getting everybody else cajoled and going forward. And again, today that seems to be reflected in society. So I think communities of character can happen, and you do need all the things people have talked about. But perhaps the other thing that would help would be that driving force, the figurehead, the leader, to make it come to life.
Thank you. This is the moment at which we open it up to the audience. We've got about 15 minutes or so in which any of you who are on this call can raise a point. We'd ask you to raise your hand, much as I'm doing, and I shall try to keep my eyes going along the thumbnails to let you in to ask a question. Would you please give your name? And it hardly needs me to say, but I will, because I spend lots of my life saying things that people don't really need me to say. Would you unmute yourself, and then we'll hear you. And then panelists, I'm going to give you the inside of 5 minutes for all four of you. There's a challenge to just sum up, to have a final word at the end of this round about 4 o'clock. Anyone from the audience, show me a hand, ladies and gentlemen. Who'd like to jump in and contribute?
It's like being on one of the lessons at school, Ian, where we ask the children to put their hands up, or when you do things like concerts and nobody sits in the front row.
Or that moment where you give a business presentation and say, "Any questions?" and nobody has one. But I have a question, because
Sure.
I'd really like to hear from Graham, actually, if that's okay. He's a leader I respect, and I'd really like to get his opinions on the subject.
Excellent. Just thanks, Paul. Just I was typing a note saying apologies, Ian, but I need to leave in a couple of minutes because I've got another call at 1:45. So excellent timing. I think it's been a really challenging debate, really good debate. Actually, it's brought a number of characteristics, but the question for me is that one about diversity and inclusion, and how do you include all of the talents in all of those circumstances? And there's no doubt for me that organizations thrive on having a wider range of views being expressed all the time. So that's absolutely true. But like the colleague you were talking about, I want to create a culture in the council that is the culture that I want to create. That's got to be open and inclusive, but it's absolutely got to be delivery focused. It's got to be about helping people. It's got to be about using our resources more efficiently than we have in the past. So all of that's got to be in there. But I also want it to be open and inclusive, and I wonder how we get that balance between community of character, single-mindedness, obsessiveness that entrepreneurs need, and also inclusion and equality, and therefore making sure nobody is removed from that. So that's where I was coming from. I thought it was a really interesting debate that got me to that point. So.
Thank you, Graham. Grateful to you for coming in before you've got to go in a moment. Anybody want to respond or go further in that particular discussion? Danny Tamblyn.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point there, Graham. That it's been said that you can't demand that people are ethical by oath. So you can't sign up just to be ethical for the sake of being ethical. You either are or you aren't, arguably. But there's an element of carrot and stick, I think, there that my experience has been in certain areas that if you don't legislate in certain areas and require certain behaviours, people will not act in a certain way. Now, that's not to say that legislation is the only way out of it, and certainly we can't arrest our way out of an awful lot of our challenges. But if you think of it in terms of drink driving, for example, there was a time when drink driving was socially acceptable. It became less acceptable through a period of education to let people know the consequences, let people know the effects, but also by a period of enforcement. So I think that as you said, it's a diverse workplace, but it's your vision, and you're making sure that vision happens. That is the part, I think, where the police play a significant part, not only as a community of character in our own right, but in ensuring that where required, if people fall outside of an accepted level of behaviour, then there will be a consequence. And without that, I don't think certain structures would be able to be maintained.
Anyway, who's going to follow on there?
I was going to ask a question of Danny, actually, if I may. Excuse me. I mean, Paul was talking about culture, and in fact, Graham brought that up as well. And I think, in my mind, when I look at schools, there is a real sense, I think, in many that for things that we've spoken about around expectations and rules, consistency, transparency, a commitment to values, I think you can get to the stage where you develop a culture in an environment like a school. And I think you can in a business as well, because I mean, ultimately schools are businesses, where there's a kind of almost like self-policing that goes on. I mean, I think of an incident or a situation with a colleague last term when they were doing something, helping a student with something, and I said, well, thanks, I really appreciate you doing that. And I said, why? And the lady teacher came back and said, well, that's just what we do here. And I thought, that's music, music to my ears as the head. I guess we would say we've worked hard to be consistent, we have the right values, we listen to people. And I suppose my question to Danny is, I see that working in an environment like a school and a business. Do you see that working in kind of geographic communities in the same way? Do you think we've heard the word leadership. Do you think that with the right leaders in those environments, that you can develop a kind of almost like built-in change and expectation without the need perhaps for the policing that you might normally expect?
Yes and no. So can leaders in communities make a significant contribution towards that? Undoubtedly. And I think the example you gave there of a school, I think that's where it starts. Education, I think, is so important. The importance of it can't be overestimated. That's where it starts. There are no 3, 4, 5-year-olds who are racist, homophobic, or bigoted. They develop those skills for what they see around them and what society puts on them. As a father of a 9-year-old, some of the things she's been exposed to through education, television, it has been really interesting to see how non-judgmental children are compared with my experience as a police officer of how judgmental people are. So can leaders in communities contribute towards that? Absolutely. However, the disruptive ability of a tiny minority to impose their character is disproportionate. There's a power few issue there. So if you, I don't always like using that analogy, but it's quite clear. If you had a glass full of clean water and you put one drop of ink or one drop of dirty water into it, that will dirty the water. If you put one drop of clean water into a dirty glass, it will have no effect. And it's a very crude example and a very oversimplified one, but if someone is acting, for example, in an antisocial manner, that is by far and away the number one cause of concern for the public is antisocial behaviour, along with drug dealing. If someone is acting antisocially, it's very difficult to stop them from doing that, particularly if they have mental health issues. So there's a vulnerability attached to their behaviour as well. And there can come a point where the only way of stopping that behaviour, once you've tried education and tried diversion, is to enforce it. So I think they will always have, sadly, I will always have a role, I will always have a part to play in enforcing it. But I think that should come at the far end of a spectrum where the community itself should hopefully deal with its own, for a better phrase.
So there's been enforcement, and to what extent do we involve people in their own rehabilitation? So to what extent do we involve people in prison in forming the character of the prison? They do that de facto, but do we invite people to get involved in their own rehabilitation? I'm speaking from 3 years' experience as an assistant prison chaplain some years ago. So I've felt something of the character of a particular prison. And I've done some recent research with quite a lot of others, some of whom are in this room, on homelessness and rough sleeping. To what extent do we invite people who seem to have dropped out of the system almost altogether to get involved in their own rehabilitation and to say, you're not just this rather regrettable minority, but actually we value each person. So understandings of common good are that it's not only the majority, it's actually each person who is of value. Where do we stand with those whom we think are deviant and drop out? There we are. We've got another 5 minutes or so to kick that around. I wasn't aiming that specifically. I wasn't specifically targeting you, Danny, but anybody. Jump in.
I'll probably take that very, very briefly. I think fundamentally the answer has to be as much as possible. Yeah. So in prison, we have a very broad spectrum of people. There are some people for whom rehabilitation can and will work, and there are some people who it absolutely will not. It's an ethical dilemma that's been plaguing us since we've had prisons. Does prison stop recidivism? No, it doesn't. It would stop you and I, perhaps, because you and I are perhaps not the sort of people on this panel that would go to prison in the first place. There's an argument that it's just desserts, and there's an argument that at the very least it stops people harming the rest of the society whilst they're locked up. But I'd liken this to the NHS and their treatment of smokers, for example. There are some people who argue that the NHS shouldn't be investing large amount of money in people who smoke and the illnesses it causes for various reasons. However, ignoring people with that addiction doesn't stop it. And if their addiction leads to health problems which are going to cost £50,000, and an investment in them, a diversionary scheme of £10,000 makes economical and ethical sense. And the same thing with homelessness, the example you gave. One of the most successful treatments of homelessness or responses to homelessness came in a state in the USA where they continually offered accommodation to homeless people, whether they liked it or not, and eventually most of them took it. The moral problem of that is you have people working 2 or 3 jobs on benefits, desperately struggling, who haven't been given that opportunity. So you can't always have, you can have a solution, but it's not always going to be a morally acceptable solution. So it's the same with prisoners, as it is with the youth, as it is with seldom heard communities. If we want to know how to resolve the issues surrounding them, we have to involve them.
Anyone else? Father Andrew Wagstaff, would you like to come in?
Yes, Andrew Wagstaff. I'm Catholic priest at the Sacred Heart Church on Richmond Hill. I just wonder, Ian, with your question about rehabilitation there, and listening to the voices of those who have already, as it were, fallen through the net of society. I wonder if we ought to at least apply some kind of filter to that, with the awareness that those people are likely to want to blame the system. So maybe we need to just be aware that that's the place from which they're likely to be coming from, and that actually it may very well be that the system is not actually that bad in general, but they, for whatever reason, have not engaged with it at an earlier stage, and that's got them to where they are now.
Other people like to come in? From the audience generally, I'm scanning along the thumbnails to see if anybody is waving a hand. How does that work in school, Russell? How do you involve kind of the deviants, as it were?
That's quite a question, Ian.
Yeah, just 3 hours.
I mean, I think it's, I mean, I scribbled down while people were talking about taking responsibility, and I think that's a big part of life, isn't it? Is being equipped to understand your part and to accept responsibility for the situation you find yourself in, and be able to find ways with support to get yourself out of it. I think that possibly sounds like a very simplistic view. I was interested as well, listening about how much of the chat, I mean, we talk about character and we talk about supporting those that have fallen perhaps by the wayside, and how much of this is down to funding and availability of funding. This is not a political broadcast at all, but I think, I look at education, I look at, I mean, obviously, not in a school like mine, thankfully, but classes growing. It's an education system where, broadly speaking, one size is supposed to fit all, but it doesn't. You talk about rehabilitation in prisons, an area I know nothing about, but one imagines with the right funding and the right people, the difference you can make to people can be extraordinary. Whereas without it, you're fundamentally self-fulfilling the prophecy that they had when they came through the doors in the first place. And I know we're moving on to a very different topic, but I think I think a lot of us understand what is needed to help to improve character, culture, opportunity, taking decisions, the right decisions, taking responsibility. But does our society allow us to? Do we have the funding priorities in the right way? Maybe that's for another ethical discussion, Ian.
No, it's fascinating, Russell. I mean, one of my memories from when I was assistant prison chaplain, and I left that role in 2002, was of Governor One, that's the chief governor at the prison, saying to me despondently that the expectation that was upon him was to produce a restorative community, a rehabilitative community with too little money. So prisoners were too closely, he had twice as many prisoners as he should have had, and they were banged up in isolation for too much time. So yes, these things do impact, they really do. We are now in the last 4 minutes. Inevitably, in these sessions, we scratch the surface, and that's what we're aiming to do, of some hugely fascinating topics that are hot potatoes, that impact our lives and the well-being of our society. Of course, over the course of a series of these ethics forums, we come into things from different angles. Before I then speak about next week, could I ask each of our panelists to just have a final word? I know you're not going to sort out all the problems of the universe in 30 seconds flat, but to give you, we're really grateful to you, the 4 panelists, for having clearly thought about this beforehand and being prepared to go up front and engage in discussion today. Andy or Paul, haven't heard from you for the last few minutes. Would you like to have a final word?
After you, Andy.
Okay. I think my final word, again, thank you for inviting me. Fascinating insights into all sorts of different areas of life. I think for me, we're in this world and it's going forward at a pace that some of us can't really fathom or really understand, and even I probably don't understand some of it. And we talk about communities. I'm coming up from a digital perspective. Some of the people I've met online, I've never actually met them physically. I feel I have connection with them. I feel like I've built a community of trusted friends over time. I think there's a massive amount of opportunity the world is presenting to us in 2020 and beyond. But we do have to watch out for bad actors. And I think, if we're going to do anything to build better communities going forward, I think it's about instilling better values into people, ideally as young as possible. As you said, 3 and 4 and 5-year-olds, they're not homophobic, they're not racist, they learn these things. And I think if we can start to maybe think about education as a way out of some of these problems in the coming years, then to me, we have to let all these things play out, but that would be a way to see communities evolve and harness this power we have now to better everybody's lives. Again, I don't know if that really covers anything, but it's just a final thought.
No, it's really helpful, Andy. Grateful to you for being here today. Paul, so a word from you.
Okay, well, we've been talking about character a lot today, and about obviously communities of character. My favourite book in the world is The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, written by Stephen Covey, who is a Christian, and Emma, clearly, I think you acknowledging that it's one of yours as well. Excellent. I mean, it's just, for me, I think communities have to have a code. And that if I were made Prime Minister tomorrow, which is highly unlikely, but if I were, I would ensure that there was a code that taught to all children, and it would be the 7 habits. I would make sure that the 7 habits of highly effective people was the universal code that everybody was living by. And it's simple stuff. It's taking responsibility, being proactive, beginning with the end in mind, putting first things first, which is priorities and things, thinking win-win in terms of sustainable relationships, seeking first to understand before seeking to be understood, to look for synergy and to constantly be sharpening the saw or improving oneself. So I think that all communities of character need a code. And I dare say in schools they're not allowed to teach one specific religious code, because everybody had one once upon a time. It was called the 10 Commandments, but perhaps it's not politically correct to teach one code anymore. But outside of that, the 7 habits is the code I would teach everybody. I give the book to everybody who comes on work experience and everybody I employ into Gauge, and we build our culture around it.
Thank you, Paul. It's really great that you've been on board with us today. Russell, a final word from you for today?
Thank you, Ian, and thank you for inviting me. I mean, I think people have said it. I suppose what I would say is perhaps going back to our beginning point. I think we've identified as a group that having a set of values, set of expectations, a culture is really important in developing character. And I think, perhaps bringing in Andy's point about the speed and of change, surely the challenge is about how that set of values reflects, how social media companies behave. In many ways, the influence that they have is going to be far greater than anything we do, on community, our kind of level. So to what extent that set of values can be adopted by the likes of Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, seems to me an important challenge. I mean, Andy's shaking his head, and I agree. But I've got 2 young children, 9 and 14, and I look at it as a dad and think, how do I help them to behave appropriately on this kind of digital ether, when maybe the people that are running that digital ether don't have a set of values that reflect my own. And I think that's a challenge for us all.
Thank you, Russell. And Danny, a final word.
Again, thank you all for having me here. Robert Peel, the Home Secretary who founded the police service, once said that the test of police efficiency is the absence of crime and disorder, not the visible evidence of police action in dealing with it. So what I take from that message is, by the time it comes to the police to start looking at creating communities of character, we're a bit late. So if I had my choice about where my money be invested in, it would be in schools and education, and social services, so that we support families to get it right in the first place, rather than leaving us up to clear up the mess, for want of a better phrase. Appreciate it's not as simple as that, and the police certainly have a role in not just enforcing certain laws that create communities of character, but playing our part as examples as well. So my final word, I guess, would be a message of tolerance, a message of responsibility, to reiterate what's already been said. And in terms of, we found with social media, when I joined the police, there was no social media. There was barely any internet. And the way that we can commit crimes now, I can commit a crime against somebody, whether it is sending the person an indecent photograph or trying to defraud them, anywhere in the world at the touch of a button. Whereas I used to be a criminal, whereas one would used to have to physically visit somebody, and there'll be a consequence. If I insulted someone on the street, they'd punch me on the nose. Now I can insult anybody anywhere in the world. So I think with the message of responsibility, regardless of consequence, regardless of police action or interaction, has to be a clear message.
Thank you, Danny. Been really good that you've been part of this again today, as also Paul and Andy and Russell. Ladies and gentlemen, all of you on this call, and those of you who will watch it on YouTube, which I hope is many, I hope this has stimulated your thinking. We've never pretended that there were easy answers to these questions, but come back on board at 3 p.m. next week, if you can. Use the same link. I shall be the doorkeeper again next week, letting people into the meeting. My friend, Rabbi Maurice Michaels, is going to be in the chair next week. And we're going to come, we're not going to do this every week, but we're going to come at a similar thing from a different angle next week. We're going to be asking the question, limits to democracy. So if we attempt to be utilitarian and please the majority, what almost inevitably happens to minorities? And Rabbi Maurice is particularly going to be in the chair because the various Jewish communities have found themselves feelingly and significantly in the minority. This is, after all, Holocaust Memorial Day, is it not, today? So I do hope you will be back with us again next week, ladies and gentlemen, and I want to thank again all of our 4 panelists and you all for joining in. See you next week. Thank you very much. That's goodbye for today from our ethics forums. Goodbye for today.